I'm sure you've noticed that everything is more expensive nowadays. Gas prices, the housing market, eggs, whatever. And it's really easy to blame that on post-pandemic inflation, or we're just getting back to normal. But if that were entirely true, then why is it that 53% of the inflation that we saw from April to September of 2023 was driven by corporate profit? That's 53% compared to only 11% price inflation over the 4 decades prior to the pandemic. Now, this means two very important things for the economy. The first is that paychecks of consumers like you or me won't go as far as they used to. Prices are higher, so we become poorer under the same income. And the second is that corporate profits are skyrocketing. Shareholders and executives of giant companies are facing astronomical revenues on our dime, and the richest percentile only continues to become wealthier. In fact, income inequality in the US has returned to Gilded Age levels. That was back when fat men in suits held monopolies over the railroads. Income inequality has become so extreme that as of 2020, the wealthiest 1% of Americans makes around 104 times as much as the bottom 20%. That's insane, and as long as equitable distribution of income stays on the back burner, that separation is only going to grow. Now, we in the US have seen a steady rise in worker productivity since the 1940s, and yet, for the last 50 years, worker compensation has essentially flatlined. With that, we see record lows in union membership each new year. This is practically all to say that we're working harder than ever for less and less of a paycheck, and now we're losing the means to fight for change. Even Morris Pearl, millionaire and former managing director of investment giant BlackRock, says, quote, "The growing gap between rich and poor has destabilized the global economy, exacerbated the rise of extremist politics, and frayed the very fabric of our social order. These are real effects that we see around us every day, and without change, we can only expect conditions to worsen." What's nice, however, is that fair income distribution actually brings with it a handful of accessory benefits beyond simply avoiding the aforementioned negative consequences. For one, poor people have a higher propensity to consume. Propensity to consume is the proportion of your income spent on purchases, and since poor people receive smaller wages, the amount that they need to spend on necessities or vanities makes up a larger percentage of that wage compared to somebody with a larger wage. This means that by redistributing wealth more fairly, fewer people will be excessively rich, and therefore people are more likely to consume, thereby raising aggregate demand, thereby spurring economic growth, and raising GDP. And plus, when wealth is so unfairly concentrated like it is, the average citizen over time becomes gradually less wealthy, which means eventually individuals will find it difficult to afford education or healthcare, patterns that we already see today. This will vastly bring down our standard of living, as well as harming the factors of production, which slow down the economy as a whole. Possessing a functional system that enforces the equitable distribution of income would indirectly and/or directly impact just about all other economic goals of the US, such as price stability, economic growth, economic security, or even happiness. We are already living through the worst wealth disparity in the last century, and without a greater focus on undoing that, we can undoubtedly expect to see our standard of living erode as the majority becomes unable to sustain themselves. As stated in the widely approved open letter to G20 addressing income inequality, quote, "The accumulation of extreme wealth by the world's richest individuals has become an economic, ecological, and human rights disaster, threatening political stability in countries all over the world. Such steep levels of inequality undermine the strength of virtually every one of our global systems and must be addressed head-on."